Hello all, welcome to another Rook Endgames lesson. This is going to be lesson 16 about the perfect cut, but now with the central pawn. Before we saw with the knight and the bishop pawn, we saw with the knight and the technique is the same for the bishop pawn. We even saw with the third rank and second rank knight. Now we start with a fourth rank central pawn. And this is still a winning for white, but we need to be more precise. So the center the pawn, the more precise we need to be. Uh, we are cutting the king again with a perfect cut. The king is on the same rank as our pawn. So here the technique it's the same. We need to go up with our king. Of course, the ideal would be to start immediately on e5 with our rook, but of course the enemy rook is not helping on that one. So we are going to see how to reach that. And over here, the most common mistake we need to avoid, and Rook Endgames are always about the small details, is if you try to advance the pawn, which works with a knight pawn or even with a bishop pawn, here it's going to fail very badly. We are going to draw this one. How to defend from here? Well, the rook comes and confronts both the pawn and the other rook. Of course, the rook taking and the king taking back is going to be a draw, pawn and game, so that's not an option for white. And so white is forced to check, but now because on the knight pawn we have more distance, here the distance is very short, so the king is able to retreat but attacking our rook, sorry for the arrow, attacking our rook, and at the same time the rook is attacking our pawn. So the only move possible is to go with the rook behind the pawn protecting it, but now as a defense we can reach with the king. So over here maybe we can start by, let's say, advance the pawn. That's one option. We simply keep attacking, so after a while it's going to be lost. This is the easiest to grab the pawn. The other one is to bring the king, but again we are going to move with our king to the front of the pawn. That's always the technique, move to the king in front of the pawn so we reach a draw position, and from here it's impossible for white to progress. Let's say the rook tries to come away, well, we can move the rook also to check from behind, and even if the king attacks our rook, we again attack the pawn, and there's no chance for white to keep progressing anymore. So this is just a simple draw from here. So the first thing we need to remember is if we are playing with the central pawn, we need to go with that technique of bringing the rook over here, protecting the king, and then only then coming back and advancing the pawn. So we are going to see this in action. So first we move the king outside. Of course, other thing we are going to see from here is what happens if the king attacks our rook now. Well, we simply confront the other rook, and when the rook moves, we simply get into the same position as the main line. Other options over here for black is to come behind, but this doesn't help. This just allows us to advance the pawn. Now, yes, we can. Our king is far better position, and so if the king tries to harass our rook, we simply move one rank up, so we keep the perfect cut, but now with the pawn already crossing the middle of the board. So this is going to be really easy. And of course, over here we just go to the other side, and after a while now I am already preparing to go for a Scipione Lucena position. The technique is already known. If you want to remember that, just go to lesson number 1, the Scipione Lucena position, to know how to convert it. But from here, I'm not going to lose more time. It's going to be easy. So the best defense for black is to attack our king. Notice that when we got this position, we can simply confront the rook, and if the rook takes, then this is also a winning pawn in the game. I forgot to mention that before. But here the best is to attack our king. Now we block it with our rook. That's why we are going to use the perfect along the rank cut. And now the rook goes to try to the side checks, which are very good. We are going to see this defensive technique in the next position. But here we just use the same technique we learned on the previous lesson. We move the rook up. Now, of course, here you can go up or down, of course, but I prefer to go here, and then now don't make the mistake of allowing yourself to be cut going to the 6th rank too soon, because here the black can just attack the pawn directly. As you can see, it's going to be easy to grab. So over here we need to play with patience and build up the position slowly but steadily. Now the tendency is to advance the pawn, which should be another blunder. So again, take your time when you are playing this, reset the positions so they are always organized and connected. So here the correct move, of course, is to cut the enemy king first, because we haven't our king on the best position to advance the pawn and then support it. Because if we advance it now, then simply it's going to be attacked. Now I need to protect it either with the king or the rook. Of course, if the rook protects, then it's going to be attacked from the other side, and so anyway, it's going to be lost. So over here, the best move is to cut the king along a file, okay? Don't forget that. First, take it slowly and steadily. And now the rook attacks our pawn, but now I can bring my king. The king suffers a check, but now I can block it with my rook. If the rook takes my rook, then I take back, and this is a winning pawn and game for white, so it's not an option for black. So black goes again to the corner to a8 square, and now I advance the pawn. So from here, it's going to be far easier. I'm going to shift this into a Scipione position. So first I check the king so it moves away, and only now I go down. So I don't need to rush anything. Now, of course, I can suffer checks, but after a while, now, of course, I could advance the pawn, but I prefer to cut the king. So keep it simple, no options for the other side. Now I suffer a check, okay, but anyway, this is already a winning Scipione Lucena position. Now I check the king moves away, go for the bridge, come with the king, and then building the bridge. And so this is already known for us. This is very easy from now on. So let's move on to a different position. So here I have a third rank pawn. Our rook is already in a very well place, but the enemy rook at the moment is cutting our king, and it's black to move. Black to move, and there are normally two options. So players normally either go to d8 because they are used to repeat positions, or go to a8 if they know what they are doing. Of course, going here, it's a blunder, because this just allows us to go back to the same strategy we saw just now. So this is not working. And the best technique is to go to the other side. Notice that we are now facing the position from the defensive perspective. What does black wants? He wants to cut our king from the pawn. So if the pawn advances now, this is going to be, of course, this is a blunder, because the rook goes there. Let's say, for example, I attack the rook and now the pawn advances, something like this. Now the best move is to cut the king, and it's over. I will always be able to advance with my king and probably into the front of the pawn. And if the pawn and the rook advance too much, after a while, I'm going to be able just to bring back my rook and grab the pawn. So this is not an option for white, although it's not avoidable. After some time, it's going to be a draw anyway. But the idea from black is to do that. If the black king tries to come up in front, then we are going to use the frontal attacks that we already saw that, and we are going to keep checking the king until it goes back. Let's see some options over here. Let's start, for example, from moving the rook. If it moves the rook, then I simply keep my rook on a8 and move the king up. So I attack the rook. Because now, as we saw, if it advances the pawn, then I cut the king forever. Notice that from now on, white can't progress anymore. So this is going to be really simple. Of course, from here, let's say the rook goes a bit more ahead. Well, the same idea. We move the king. Of course, if move the pawn, we just cut. We saw that already. And so if now the king tries to come up, then we use the frontal checks. Check, check again, check again, and notice that now the rook can't block it. Let's say, for example, if it blocks, because now I will be on time to grab the pawn. So this is also not an option. So from here, we simply check the king until white gets tired and goes back to the same position. As soon as the king is on the first on the starting position, well, we just go to the corner to a8, and so we are ready again to repeat it until white agrees that there's no much more to do and accepts the draw. Of course, this is easier talking than done, so always pay attention. Okay, let's go back to the starting position, but now let's move the king. When the king moves, so the king tries to move away, it's too soon for the frontal check. Okay, if I force the check now, then white can just go back to the same technique we saw before, and it's going to be able to advance the pawn, and from the pawn on the force, we already know it's already a win for white if they keep doing the proper technique. So over here, we are going to check from the side. We are going to use this side check. The king is forced to come back. If the king goes up, it's going to be easier. And so now the tendency is to move the rook, but moving the rook is the mistake. So we want to go and always pay attention to what's going, it's happening over here. So if we move the rook, it's going to be a mistake because now the king has access to b3. And so there's no side checks anymore. So the rook needs to go from the frontal attacks, and now we reach this position, which is very bad for black. So always notice that we need always to play the same dance as white gives us. So if white is trying to trick us on the side checks, then we move our king, and of course we are going to move to f2. So now the rook goes there, and now we move the king away, and the pawn advances. Okay, I keep moving the king, and I got the separation for free. There's nothing more white can do. Of course, it can advance the pawn. I let it. And after a while, of course, I will try to do something. Notice that white king is now too far away. So trying to protect the pawn is not going to happen anymore. And now I attack the rook and attack the rook and attack the rook. And so there's no way white can force from here. So this is going to be, of course, a draw. So let's go with this start position, but let's say black goes into this horrible mistake. And if you read the theory books about this, they all say, okay, if you got a central pawn, then it's a win. But if you got third rank or second rank, it's a draw. But not always, okay? Because, and this position is going to be the example. We are able to win from here, but we need to know how to do it. Of course, this is the bad passive move, but sometimes we are going to get them, and that's how we outplay our opponents. So here we bring the king, of course, there's no doubt about it. So we got attacked by the rook. Okay, we protect, so we block it. So the exchange is favorable for white, of course. It's a winning pawn end game for white. And now the rook tries to recover and go to the side checks. But now we start the technique. We place our rook one rank up. Of course, we suffer the check. Then we go to c4, check again. Again, I'm not going to allow the same mistake. So the king would come, and then I am threatening and to cut and win the pawn. So I need to come back to b3, but this is the correct move. Here, black can go sideways, can go up, down, doesn't matter. Let's say it goes down, because the next move is going always to be the same. So my king is too far away from the pawn to advance it, so advancing would be a mistake. So first, I cut the enemy king from the file. Now black to play, let's say attacks the pawn. Now I protect the pawn. I got this check, and now I can go to d5. Now, yes, because I'm able to advance the pawn on the next move. There's more or less no chance for black to avoid that. So let's say black moves to the frontal attacks technique. Now I advance the pawn, and now black moves and attacks our more or less the position of our rook. And here, if you notice, now we can play the cut by one file technique that we already saw in a previous lesson. So let's keep our rook cutting the enemy king. Don't need to mix up techniques. We just need to keep it simple, because if we advance the pawn just one more square, we are going to be able to reach the famous Scipione Lucena position, of course. And over here, it's black to play. Let's say black checks our king, and now I come back. So the idea is to reset the position of the king before improving, as we saw before on the fourth pawn technique. Over here, I am threatening to advance the pawn, so I am expecting this check. So I come back to the pawn. Of course, I am threatening to advance the pawn again. So black is more or less forced to place the rook in front. And now notice that this is a key movement, a key moment. So now I check the king. So to force the king to stay 2 files away from the pawn. And only now I am going to use my king to recover the position and advancing the pawn supported by the rook. If you don't remember that, then I suggest review the lessons before, because after a while, and practice against the engine, of course, because after a while, that's how you get the so-called intuition. Intuition comes from repeating the same positions, starting to recognize the patterns, and then you don't need to think, you are going to remember them and play them by heart. So over here, again, we are threatening to advance the pawn. So the rook either checks or goes attacks the pawn. So we protect the pawn. The rook checks us again. And so now we reach this position. This is the pure technique that we already know before, but nevertheless, always good to remember. So now I am ready to support the advancing of the pawn, because the enemy king is too far away. Of course, the king moves closer, but now I advance the pawn, and now the king attacks my rook. This is also another key technique, because at first you may think, okay, if I go to the other side and the king attacks my rook, I come back, then the king comes back again, and I can't go out of here, because if I go to the side, then the rook takes the pawn. But remember this one, our rook is attacked, but we are going also to attack the enemy rook. And now the enemy rook needs to move, because otherwise I am going to grab it and I am in the perfect position to promote the pawn. So the rook moves away, and now yes, I can move my rook. The king attacks my rook, but now I keep the king cut off from the pawn. And so from here, it's impossible for black to avoid me, to keep supporting the pawn advancing. The rook alone can't stop it. So even if it checks one time, 2 times, try to go back, and notice that after a while, this is just going to be easy. Now I can even use the block from the enemy king to be faster. And so over here, it's, of course, game over. So this was the theory. Now let's see this in practice against the engine. Let me just change here the screens. Let's play this first position. So let's start with the move where black played to the passive situation. So I come back with my king. Notice that now I protect with my rook. Okay, the rook goes to the corner. What is the correct move? I start to build up. Now I can't avoid this one. Of course, I'm not going to be giving the draw for free and allowing the king to approach and then losing my pawn. So I need to come down. And now the rook decides to go up. Notice that on the theory we saw the rook coming down. Here, whatever the move, I need to control also the enemy king. So the best is to cut the file. And so now I bring my king. Now I can block with the rook. And now I am ready to go and advance the pawn. So the first phase was that. So now, as you can see here, I can simply play simple chess, because now it's impossible for black to avoid me to promote. So I simply go and repeat the same technique. So again, and now again, don't forget, first cut the king, okay, it attacks the pawn, okay. This is more or less going to repeat sometime. Okay, it's attack our pawn. So here we need to keep playing with our brains. So again, the king is moving, whatever. I can now start to advance the pawn, whatever. And now I can bring my king. Okay, I'm check, no problem. And from here, let's say this is so easy from now on that I don't even know what is that I want to do. Let's say, for example, over here, like this, I am already controlling the enemy king. I'm going to cut the king so to make sure. Maybe this is not the most efficient or the most perfect way to play, but whatever. I just want to play simple. Ah, I forgot. I forgot to build a bridge. So sometimes we already play so in auto mode that sometimes we make some moves too ahead. Here I like to check, then he allows me to decide whatever, and now I can promote. And of course, this is going to be an easy win for white. Let's play again this position just one more time. Let's see what black can bring to the table. So over here I go here. Okay, no repetition. Now it's go down. So first I cut the king on the file. Okay, it checks my king. Now I can advance the pawn. Of course, here I want to keep the now I reset. Notice that I am always threatening to advance the pawn. This important check, don't forget that. And now I start to build up again. So if the king attacks our rook, I can simply go and help advance the pawn now. So it's going to be easier. Notice that now I am attacked, but I have time. There's not the same situation we had on the previous theory scenario. Here I can do several things, but let's stay with the king cut off. Notice that I am not allowing it to escape. Now I can simply go protect my king, open the doors so the pawn can be promoted and down again. Okay, one last time, just one more. I told you that it was the last one, but this was kind of a bit easier. So let's see. Okay, this is going to repeat probably. Not the best. Let's say, for example, over here, let's say, okay, okay, okay. As you can see, after a while, we almost play this in auto mode. Of course, now I need to bring my king. Okay, is expecting, and now we are going to be able to repeat. Notice that when this happens, I attack the rook first, and only after I can move my rook. Okay, this is more or less the same we got on the theory time. Okay, now I go there. Okay, here it's not going to be that hard to promote the pawn. Let's say I don't even know what is the best way to choose. Let's say over here and now, of course. Okay, this is done now. Okay, I'm not going to let them to take my rook. So let's change to the final position. This is going to be a bit harder. So it's black to play. So let's change here the screen to the black side. And of course, we are going to play defense from now on. So remember, we go to the side. So let's force here white to play. Okay, white came with the rook. So in this situation, we use our king. The pawn advancing, it's a big mistake from white, just makes our life easier. We simply cut the enemy king. And now, of course, we can just move to the other side. If the rook moves, I move my king. The rook moves again, well, I can come back. So I have many options over here. The only thing we need to take into consideration as soon as we are able to cut like this the enemy king is to guarantee that the king is close to the pawn and to the promotion. So not making many more mistakes, and it's enough to call it a day from here. So let's see if white tries something else, or we are just going to repeat the position. I think we are going to repeat. Okay, so let's repeat this one. It's already playing for me. Now I want the board on this side because we are playing defense over here. Now it's white to play. Okay, it goes with the same move. So let's go attack the king. No, okay. Not what we want. We don't want to repeat. Let's say let's force the engine to play this one. Okay, it already played the correct move, which is to got the king already with a side check. The king comes back, and here we need to play this move. Now the rook moves, and we want to keep the rook in this correct position, so we can already think this way. If the rook moves, I move my king. If the king moves, I can move my rook. But over here, I can keep moving the king. Notice that, just one back, notice that over here, there is a threat to check our king and get two files separation from the king and the pawn, which is not good for black. So over here, we are forced to move this one. I don't know if now what happens over here. Okay, it's white to play. So now I can keep moving the king. Notice that now I can bring the rook, probably, yes, because I just need to pay attention if the enemy king doesn't have access to the b3 square. Okay, over here I can do several things, maybe go here, for example, and now I can just, I can even attack the rook, and then I can come back. Okay, the king moves, I go to the a8 square. Now I can move my king again. And as you can see, as long as I pay attention, and that's why I suggest you play against the engine, because sometimes this looks like simple, but it's because I have more experience. And as soon as the pawn advance, we already know what to do. We cut the king away, and then we just wait and wait and wait and keep waiting until it's game over. Okay, one last time. This is going to be the last one. Let's change the board. I'm not going to stay here forever. So I want white to play this one. Then I want the king to go not here but to f7. Now I want white to play this one. Yes, I am forcing moves, sorry. And now yes, this one. Now I want to check the king, but I don't want the king to come back to the same position. I want it to go to the other side. So basically, just avoiding the cut on the wrong side. Of course, if I went there, it's still a draw because I am controlling the position, but always good to understand that the king place is in front of the pawn, so to control the advancing and the pawn and the promotion. And so now I am forcing, for example, this move. No, I don't want to bring my rook yet. I want to do this, and now it's white to play from here. Let's force now white to play. So, okay. And so the thing I did this was to show you that I am going to be forced to play a Philidor position. So again, another fundamental core position. And from here, I also need to know how to play it. So notice that the king is coming into a position where it can use the pawn to shield itself, but I prefer to bring my rook down. Of course, I'm not having any problem with my king coming down because I am ready for this kind of defense. And now, for example, I can, for example, check it from the side. Notice that I am allowing white to progress, but I'm not worried, okay? From here, I'm not worried. So now I can check the king, for example. The king moves away, and now I can back to the back rank defense. Again, I can even make some little mistakes, like for example over here, because I am going to keep the position safe as much as I can. So here we may face more critical situations if we play like this. So that's why we need to always pay attention to the proper position and the proper technique. So over here, we are clearly playing the Philidor position and the short side lesson. So if the king is going to be attacked, don't forget that I want to be to the short side and rook on the long side, on the bigger side. So the king has moved. So let's say I check the king. Okay. Now I am in threat of being checkmate. So check again. And now notice that the king is playing smart. So it's going to offer the advancing of the pawn. And so are we able to go behind? Yes, we are able to go behind. So there's no progression over here again. So again, we need to pay with attention. Let's say we can go to the short side. Okay, going again. and again to the short side. Notice what happens over here. I keep the short side, or I can go in front, no matter. Because now a crucial moment. So I need to decide what to do, and the best is to go behind the pawn. Don't forget that. We saw this on the short side lesson that was more designed to help us with the defense, but we learn both sides of the board, so we can from there do our best. So over here, short side, we are under a threat of checkmate, and because we don't want anything to move from here, we just move one tempo our rook. Of course, the rook allows us to get out of the first rank. Okay, let's go there with our king. The rook moves again. Of course, I'm not going to move to the side, allowing the enemy the enemy to checkmate us. So we just lose another tempo, and so we are playing to draw. So over here, the king moves closer. So remember that when this happens, I need to bring my king. Don't make any mistake over here. Okay, this is very close to be a dangerous position, of course. So if I go here, the rook comes here. What can I do? I just move to the side again. Don't forget that. But can I allow the king to come in front? Yes, because I am not going to be checkmate. I just need to pay attention. Of course, over here I'm not going to check because I always want to keep this interesting position. The rook is threatening check, but not checkmate, so maybe I can just waste one tempo. Again, don't forget there are two sides of the board, but my king always on the short side. The rook moves, okay, so I move my king again. There's no threat of checkmate over here, so let's say I can just wait. Again, two sides of the board, let's choose the correct one. And as you can see, all the previous knowledge that we had were able to reach here and draw this position. Also, hope this last one also was instructive for you. Hope you are enjoying the lessons, and of course, I see you again in a future one. Bye bye.